10:30, August 15th, 1942. Grand Harbor, Valletta, Malta. A tanker with a broken back, a wrecked engine room, and no rudder is towed into port, lashed physically between two Royal Navy destroyers, her decks scorched, a hole blown through her side where a shot-down dive bomber crashed and exploded, crowds lining the bastions above to watch her come in. By any normal standard of seaworthiness, and by the standing doctrine of nearly every navy fighting this war, she should not be afloat at all, let alone still underway. She has been torpedoed once, bombed repeatedly over 4 days, hit by a crashing aircraft that exploded on her own deck, and abandoned twice by her own crew, who climbed back aboard both times rather than let her go. She is carrying 11,000 tons of aviation fuel that a besieged island has run almost out of, and without it, the fighters and bombers still flying from Malta's airfields will be grounded within days. The ship's name is Ohio. She will never sail again after this one voyage, and this one voyage is the only reason she needed to. By the summer of 1942, Malta had been under siege from the air for over 2 years, and the island was approaching the point of simple physical collapse. Not enough food, and critically, not enough aviation fuel to keep the Royal Air Force and Fleet Air Arm squadrons based there, flying the strikes that were quietly strangling the supply convoys, keeping Field Marshal Rommel's Africa Corps fighting in North Africa. Losing Malta as an active base meant losing the ability to interdict those Axis convoys at all.
Operation Pedestal assembled to force fuel and supplies through regardless of cost. 14 merchant ships escorted by 2 battleships, 3 aircraft carriers, 7 cruisers, and roughly 30 destroyers, drawn from across the home and Mediterranean fleets and assembled specifically for this one convoy, one of the largest escort forces ever assembled for a single convoy in the war, a measure of exactly how much the Admiralty expected to lose getting it through and how little choice it felt it had. Among the 14 merchantmen was Ohio, launched in April 1940 at the Sun Shipbuilding Yard in Chester, Pennsylvania, and owned by the Texas Oil Company. At roughly 9,300 gross tons and capable of 16 to 19 knots, she was a modern, fast tanker built for peacetime commerce, requisitioned by Britain's Ministry of War Transport that same July and placed under a British master, Captain Dudley Mason, specifically because her tanks could carry the aviation spirit Malta needed most. The convoy sailed from Britain on August 3rd, passed through the Strait of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean on the night of the 9th and 10th, and came under sustained air and submarine attack almost as soon as it was inside. Standard doctrine for a convoy under sustained attack was unambiguous about ships that fell out of formation crippled. Cut your losses, let the wreck go down or be finished off, and keep the rest of the convoy and its remaining escorts moving, rather than risk further ships and further lives trying to save one that was, by any reasonable calculation, already lost.
Ships that could not keep station were routinely left behind under this logic throughout the Battle of the Atlantic and the Mediterranean Convoy War alike, not from callousness, but because a stationary burning target attracted exactly the kind of concentrated attack that could cost far more than the one ship already written off. By the early hours of August 13th, Ohio met every definition of that category. Torpedoed the previous day by the Italian submarine Axum, she had already lost the aircraft carrier HMS Eagle from the wider escort, sunk in 8 minutes by a separate submarine attack the day before that, and had absorbed wave after wave of German and Italian bombers determined to finish what the torpedo had started. By the 13th, she had been bombed repeatedly, her engine room wrecked, her rudder gone, her back visibly broken amidships, her decks so often ablaze with burning fuel that the distinction between damaged and finished had stopped meaning much to anyone watching from the escorting warships. A Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, shot down by her own gunners as it dived on her, crashed directly into her hull forward of the bridge and exploded, and her crew, judging the ship finished, abandoned her. Twice. Both times they climbed back aboard rather than accept that a dead tanker, still carrying 11,000 tons of fuel, was worth less than the chance of getting her home. What kept Ohio moving after her own engines had failed entirely was not any property of the ship herself, but an improvised piece of seamanship that no manual described.
The destroyers HMS Ledbury and HMS Penn came alongside and lashed themselves physically to Ohio's hull, one on each side, using their own engines to drive the dead weight of a 14,000-ton tanker forward between them, while the minesweeper HMS Rye took station astern and used her own hull to nudge and steer a ship that no longer had a working rudder of her own. When air attacks scattered the towing formation and damaged Ledbury too badly to continue, the destroyer Bramham took her place without the arrangement ever fully coming apart. It was less a rescue tow than 3 small warships turning themselves into the missing engine, rudder, and hull strength of a ship that had lost all 3 for the last 40 miles into Malta. Destroyers of that size, displacing barely a tenth of Ohio's loaded weight, had never been designed to carry a crippled tanker bodily between them under continued air attack, and every mile of the arrangement risked the towing ships themselves being caught alongside a burning fuel cargo with no room to maneuver away. Ohio's ordeal ran from August 12th, when Axum's torpedo first struck her, through repeated bombing on the 13th that brought her decks awash and set her cargo tanks alight more than once, to the final approach on the 14th and 15th under continuing air attack, with Ledbury, Penn, Bramham, and Rye holding the formation together each time it was blown apart. She entered Grand Harbor at 09:30 on the 15th, decks nearly awash and still under tow the entire way, to a band playing on the dockside and crowds along the bastions who had been told, and had mostly stopped believing, that a fuel tanker was still coming.
If a ship's crew abandoning and reboarding a dying tanker twice rather than give her up is the kind of naval story that keeps you watching, subscribing costs nothing and brings the next one straight to you. The wider convoy paid heavily for what got through. Of the 14 merchant ships that had sailed, only 5 reached Malta, Ohio among them. 9 were lost, along with the aircraft carrier HMS Eagle, torpedoed and sunk within 8 minutes on the 11th. The cruisers HMS Manchester and HMS Cairo, and the destroyer HMS Foresight. 13 vessels in total, set against roughly 32,000 of the original 85,000 tons of supplies that actually reached the island. The rest scattered across the seabed of the central Mediterranean, along with the merchant ships that had carried them. Captain Dudley Mason was awarded the George Cross for the voyage, a citation that explicitly credited not just his own conduct, but that of his crew. The men who had gone back aboard a broken, burning ship twice rather than let her sink under tow. Ohio herself never sailed again. Once her cargo had been pumped out at the dockside over the following days, what remained of her broken hull was declared beyond economical repair, and she was eventually scrapped where she lay, a single voyage ship whose entire wartime service came down to those 4 days in August. The date of her arrival mattered as much in Malta as the fuel in her tanks.
August 15th is the feast of Santa Maria, the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, one of the most significant dates on the Maltese religious calendar. And Ohio's arrival on that exact day, against odds that had made her survival look essentially impossible for the previous 3, was received by much of the island as something closer to an answered prayer than a logistic success. The operation has been known in Malta ever since as Il Convoy ta Santa Maria, the Santa Maria Convoy, and it remains one of the most commemorated events in the island's modern history, marked with services and memorial events on the anniversary to this day, 8 decades on. The aviation fuel Ohio delivered let Malta's air and submarine forces resume the offensive against Axis shipping to North Africa within weeks, at a moment when Rommel's supply situation ahead of El Alamein was already critical. A base that had been within days of losing its ability to strike back was instead able to keep sinking the tankers and transports Rommel needed for his own fuel and ammunition, tightening a logistical noose that would help decide the North African campaign that autumn, and with it, the wider Mediterranean War. None of what happened to Ohio between the 12th and the 15th of August followed from anything written on a specification sheet. On paper, a torpedoed tanker with a broken back, a wrecked engine room, and no rudder was a total loss the moment the Stuka hit her, exactly the kind of wreck standard doctrine said to cut loose rather than risk more ships saving.
What the specifications could not measure was a merchant crew willing to climb back aboard a dying ship twice after judging her lost, and 3 Royal Navy escorts willing to lash themselves to that ship's hull, absorbing the same air attacks aimed at her, and become between them the engine, rudder, and structural spine she no longer had of her own. Ohio was built to carry oil, not to survive what happened to her in the Mediterranean that August. She was not expected to finish the voyage at all. She finished it anyway, on the one day of the year Malta was most ready to call it a miracle.